Alright, here we go with day 3 of U.S. History MME review. For this one, we're going to be looking at domestic changes, things that were happening here on the home front, rather than things that were happening out there in the world that would tie into our foreign policy. We're going to hit Progressive Era, the Roaring '20s, and the Great Depression. Starting off with the Progressive Era. Top right-hand corner of the screen, you see the book The Jungle. Some of you might remember I read some excerpts of that book when you were freshmen. Basically, that book covered all the horrors in the meatpacking industry, and it talks about socialism too. First off, talking about the meatpacking industry, I remember real disgusting conditions there where like rats and rat poop and fingers and stuff would get cut up and ground up into the meat hoppers. When this book came out, it horrified a lot of Americans and disgusted them to know that the meatpacking industry was that insanitary. This led to a lot of reforms, and basically the government would start sending in inspectors to some of these meatpacking plants to make sure things were sanitary and going to be safe for home consumption. Socialism, important vocab term there, important political philosophy that you understand. Basically, to sum socialism up, it is a political philosophy where people favor that or would want the government to control the land and factories, all the means of production. So the government is going to plan things out. The government is going to be in charge of land and resources. In the middle, you have a picture of one of our national parks. Also during the Progressive Era, it was the first time under President Roosevelt that we started setting aside land to preserve America's natural beauty. So some of our first national parks were created in this time period. Land that couldn't be touched by factories or couldn't be bought by individuals and changed in any way. Next up, the NAACP also began during the Progressive Era. NAACP stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The guy pictured up there in the top left-hand corner is W.E.B. Du Bois. He was their first president. Unfortunately, the black community really didn't benefit from this time in the Progressive Era, where there were a lot of sweeping changes and a lot of good, solid reforms happening in America. Most of them really didn't benefit the black community. They aren't going to have their rights advanced until later on in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, in that time period that we'd call the Civil Rights Movement. Women's suffrage. Women do benefit quite a bit during this time period. The big thing is that women are finally able to achieve is suffrage, which suffrage, remember, is kind of a fancy way of saying voting rights. Some of you might remember that movie I showed back in freshman year, Iron Jawed Angels, where it featured like Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, Carrie Chapman Catt, and some of these women would go out and they'd picket in front of the White House, showed how some of them were locked up and put in prison, force-fed, but the women's rights movement really had a lot of success in this time period because some of these women were so persistent and they were able to get universal suffrage in the United States, so it was equal with men. Next up, moving on into the Roaring '20s. A couple different things to cover here. Remember, women, now that they've got the right to vote, it really kind of changes a lot of their attitudes. Flappers. That was a new style that came out where women started cutting their hair shorter, started partying. Some women would go out and smoke and drink and party just with the guys. Previously that had been seen as very unladylike. Now women are feeling a little bit more liberated, and they're going out and not necessarily always listening to their parents or their fathers, but more going out and doing what they want to do. Top right hand corner, and then also in the bottom right hand corner, we have some images from the Scopes trial, also known as the Scopes monkey trial. That was a huge trial in the 1920s. They gained national publicity and attention, where it was being decided whether evolution or creation should be taught in the public schools. Also, remember, jazz was kind of considered an original American art form, new kind of music that bloomed out of the African American community. Jazz music swept America in the 1920s, became very, very popular in both the black and white community. So that was kind of the featured music of that time period. Prohibition. Prohibition was the law of the land throughout the 1920s on through to 1933. So for 13 years in the United States, alcohol was illegal. Basically, you couldn't go, bars shut down. You couldn't go to your local grocery market or liquor store. They were put out of business because you couldn't buy alcohol anymore in the United States. Fairly unpopular law. It had good intentions. It was really pushed because it was thought that by making alcohol illegal, you cut down on abuse and violence in the home, domestic violence. Didn't really work though. People still wanted to drink, so what it did was created a huge black market for alcohol. Guys like Al Capone became very, very wealthy, supplying illegal liquor to people around the country. Next up, remember the stock market crashes in 1929. Shortly thereafter, the economy goes into a deep, deep depression. Some of the worst economic times the country has ever faced. A lot of people blamed President Hoover for not doing enough. The picture in the top right-hand corner is one of those shanty towns where homeless people that couldn't pay their mortgages anymore just went out to places like Central Park and community lands in big cities across the nation and set up houses there and lived because they had nowhere else to go. The guy pictured in the middle there is FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. He was elected in 1932, and he promised a lot of changes. Basically, his big his programs that he was bringing in were called the New Deal. New Deal programs, they were designed to create jobs and build up the economy. You also have another big problem, an unfortunate thing that happened due to poor farming practices out in the Great Plains and out west, and because of a severe drought over a few-year period, was the Dust Bowl. You can see like those huge dust storms, and a lot of American farmland was completely destroyed. So that compounded the problems of the Depression because there were also some food shortages.